Hello, I'm Dr Joanne Wallis. I'm from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre here at the Australian National University. I'm joined by Dr Gordon Peake, who's a visiting fellow in the State Society and Governance in Melanesia Program, and Dr Sinclair Dinnen, who's a senior fellow in the State Society and Governance in Melanesia Program. We're here today to talk about a workshop that we held on Friday the 8th of February here at the ANU. It was titled The South Pacific, From Arc of Instability to Arc of Opportunity. Is it time for Australia to shift its priorities from security to development in the South Pacific?
Perhaps we could start by looking at the concept of the arc of instability and a little bit about what that means. Maybe you could start, Joanne, with...
Yeah, so the term arc of instability emerged in 1999, and it was coined by an emeritus professor in my department in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, Paul Dibb. And he came up with the term to describe a pattern of instability and insecurity that had been occurring in the region, that had been identified by the Australian government as a concern. And this phrase was picked up by the government and became quite influential in Australian policy and academic debates about the region. It was very controversial though, and did attract quite a lot of criticism from within the region. And that was one of our purposes of our workshop, was to revisit this term and to see whether it was time to move on to a new view of the region.
Yeah, I think my understanding as well was that it began with particular reference to Indonesia and the sort of turbulence during the post-Suharto years, spreading to obviously to East Timor and its difficult birth as an independent nation, and then gradually extended eastwards into the Pacific. What were the main goals of the workshop in addressing this issue?
Well, we identified that the region there had been a shift in the region, that it was more secure today than it had been, say, 10 or 15 years ago. The Ramsay and Solomon Islands is drawing down. The stabilisation force in Timor-Leste has withdrawn. Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste had relatively peaceful elections this year. So it seemed like time to redress the term arc of instability and see if we could move towards perhaps a more optimistic or a more constructive approach to framing the region.
Yeah, and I think as well, any kind of generalisation obviously obscures a lot of the diversity in the region, and the fact that, you know, there are many different countries that are encompassed by this generalisation. And I suppose also the notion of the arc of instability is very much focused on things going wrong, and that also obscures the sort of resilience and, you know, the fact that there's lots of very positive things happening in the region as well. It's a very Australian-centric and I guess a very security-centric sort of view of the region. How do the countries in the region, covered by the arc, how do they sort of respond to being labelled as part of the arc of instability?
That's a good question, Sinclair. Thank you for the opportunity to be here for the interview. What is striking to me at the conference that we had was, you and I were on a panel together. I was discussing Timor-Leste, you were discussing Solomon Islands, we had other colleagues that were discussing Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu and Fiji, and what was very striking to me, even just from that one session, was just how vastly different a lot of these countries actually are. Very, very different in terms of population size, very, very different in terms of geography, very, very different in terms of history. And so the question, I guess, is how useful this catch-all phrase is to capture 5 very, very diverse countries within it. The other issue is whether this phrase itself is actually a phrase that's popular within the countries themselves. Is this something that the leadership in Papua New Guinea or the leadership in Timor-Leste or Fiji or Vanuatu would subscribe to? Would they enjoy being characterised as being part of an arc of instability? And I think the answer is that they probably wouldn't. It seems it carries a sort of neo-colonial connotations, and we know from sort of looking at recent history in Papua New Guinea, the relationship between the former Prime Minister Somare and the Australian government and in Solomon Islands with the former Prime Minister Suarez. There, how much they shirked from this characterization of being a failed state, being something that that was in need of the recipient of Australian aid. So, while it may be a phrase that's quite live in Australian policy circles, and that's a matter for debate. We might talk about that in the course of the rest of the interview. I'm not sure how much the leadership of the countries would actually enjoy being characterized as being a member of the arc of instability. No one likes to be critiqued for perceived weaknesses, and I think the phrase itself conjures up images of weakness and not of the great strengths and resiliences that there are in these countries, which we discussed at the conference.
No, I think that's very true, and I think the two sort of examples that you pointed out of both Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands, where leaders in the form of Prime Minister Samari, as he then was, and Prime Minister Sogavari, as he then was, took great offence at that kind of label, and that actually complicated an already quite complicated relationship, I think. And in some ways, when we are talking about countries that have had a long history of being framed in fairly negative terms by the outside world, but by their closest and largest neighbour in particular, and when that neighbour itself has been a colonial power in the region in relation to Solomon Islands, I think there are all sorts of sensitivities that are offended or that can be offended when that kind of disparaging term is used. So it's not only a question of a fairly patronising attitude as expressed in these terms, but it's also the actual real impact of them in terms of the political relationship. I don't think it necessarily filters down much beyond the level of the political elite, but it's clearly a sort of factor in relationships between governments, and creates unnecessary friction, or has done in the past. And
as Joanne was saying, the phrase was coined in 1999. Now we are in 2013, 14 years on, and it's very, very striking that how much these countries are different in 2013 to what they were in 1999. Timor-Leste, the country that I know best of the five, wasn't even born as a nation then. But what Timor and Papua New Guinea have in 2013 is something that certainly wasn't present in 1999, which is great mineral wealth. The governments of both these countries have the potential to have large revenues that come from oil and gas in Timor-Leste and gas in Papua New Guinea. So it's a question about this phrase "arch of instability," which conjures up images of failed states. Does that actually reflect where these countries are today?
No, that's right. And I mean, in PNG's case, it has had a consistent period of really quite extraordinary economic growth. With figures that would be the envy of any other country in the world, not least our own in Australia. So yeah, I mean, things move on, and I suppose another factor of things changing is that Australia's influence in the region also changes, and does not remain sort of consistent as these other factors come into play. How has Australia's sort of influence in Timor sort of changed over the years that you've been looking at it, Gordon?
I mean, quite markedly in some respects. I mean, a figure that I think is quite revealing is that in the first budget of the first government in Timor-Leste since independence was returned in 2002. The budget of that in that first year was somewhere around the region of $70 million US. the budget last year was $2 billion, which is an indicative of the revenues and that we discussed. And in 10 years ago, Australian aid would have probably been on a par, or perhaps even would have potentially exceeded the national budget of Timor-Leste. Now the Australian aid is less than 100 million per year, which, if you contrast with 2 billion, is quite I think it's quite a useful way to show how much a changed country that it is. And I read this morning from some of the news wires that, in fact, the Australian aid budget to Timor-Leste is being cut this year because of so that money can be allocated towards asylums, potential refugees. Another sort of bogeyman issue that by which money is now being diverted towards. And I think that this money in the bank brings increased self-confidence. It brings a desire, totally understandable desire to go it alone. That's what independence and sovereignty is all about. And it places the Australian aid in not as important a position as it once was. And as I said at the conference on Friday, this is the first year in which Timor-Leste will not have any UN peacekeepers. This will be the first year in which they will have full control of their own policing and defence. And that's a sign of how much the country has moved on in the last 10 years. I'm not sure how much, just as I was thinking, as I was talking about Timor-Leste and the diminution in influence of Australian aid, is that a similar story that plays out in Papua New Guinea or in others of the countries in which we talked about at the conference?
I think it certainly does in the case of Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea, as you're aware, is the sort of location of a large number of major resource development projects. Probably the best known one is the LNG project in the Southern Highlands, which is set by all accounts to double the size of the national economy over its lifetime. So it will bring in enormous amounts of sort of revenue to the government. How that translates, of course, in terms of development outcomes is another sort of factor, but it does mean that insofar as there has been reliance on aid, that is diminishing rapidly as we talk. And it's not just the LNG project, there are many other projects that are starting up. I think there's also the issue of other donors who have arrived on the scene over the last 10 years, and most notably China. And of course China is becoming quite a significant donor in the region that we're talking about, those countries covered by the so-called ARC. And there's a very significant difference in the way in which China provides assistance, in that their assistance is not conditional in terms of the application of sort of strict conditionality. So there are more options, and all these developments, I think, open up sort of other options. And against that backdrop, again, Australia's sort of leverage is perhaps diminishing, which in my view requires a much smarter sort of way of operating, but it also brings to the fore the importance of establishing and maintaining very good relationships at all levels, and that's where sometimes the kind of tone in the kind of political approach can be problematic and damaging. But perhaps we can sort of close down by talking about the notion of arc of opportunity as a much more positive framing, and that was how the conference itself was framed, from arc of instability to arc of opportunity. And perhaps, Joanne, you would like to say something about that.
Yeah, we came up with the idea of arc of opportunity to try and turn the debate on its head and look at more constructive and potential ways that the region itself can develop and can think the natural resilience that's present in the region, rather than this negative view that it's seen from outside. And we were very lucky at the workshop to have some fantastic emerging Pacific scholars who came along and who gave us some really constructive, useful ideas and proposals for the ways that not only could Australia assist and facilitate local opportunities in the Pacific, but then also the ways that Pacific Islanders themselves are identifying opportunities and potential. We're very lucky that Serena Sisingian, who is the Executive Director of The Voice, which is a youth-run NGO in Papua New Guinea, for example, came and talked about the Pacific Leadership Centre that she's working to establish, which is Papua New Guineans training each other to become leaders. And she's very much focusing on the youth as the next generation of potential leaders. We had Patrick Vakoite from Fiji, who came and gave us some really constructive ways that the youth in Fiji could be a positive force for change, and also ways that Australia could help facilitate that. We also had Quentin Hanich, who came and talked about fisheries as a potential resource, as an alternative to natural resource extraction, mineral-based natural resource extraction fisheries. And he spoke about the lost opportunity at the moment, that in that Pacific states only benefit from 10% of the revenue that's generated from Pacific fisheries, but that you can see there that that's a huge opportunity and source of potential development for the Pacific states. So while we acknowledge the challenges, and they were acknowledged in several of the presentations, that the challenges the region's facing, there was this real shift to saying, well, what's the constructive potential opportunities that we can work towards? And I think that was the really important takeaway from the workshop, is that there are people out there thinking about the ways that the region can develop and grow.
I thought what was interesting about that was that when you look at these countries through a security lens, it's all hubble bubble, toil and trouble. There's all these problems on the horizon. But when you looked at it through a much wider lens, a probably more finely graded lens, you actually saw lots of potential that there were. And one of the things that I thought that was really interesting, a problem that's shared throughout probably one factor that unites all these countries that we discussed, is a bulging youth population. That has all the potential for security problems and for workaday crime problems that we have. One of the most innovative solutions to that problem of a youth bulge and to unemployment that comes with it, we talked about at this conference, was the seasonal workers scheme that Australia's produced. Not anything that's got to do with boots on the ground, to do with training up police, to do with training up militaries, but what it's got everything to do with is actually freeing up the release valve and providing cash in people's pocket that can come back in the form of remittance that may actually have much more tangible outcomes. So almost in 1999, when the phrase was coined, it was all talk about Australia going over there. Now it strikes me that one of the themes that emerged out of the conference, and which we can maybe discuss more in the work that I believe is going to go forward as a result of this, is actually people coming here. And that means a very different type of engagement. It means freeing up visas. It means opening up increased opportunities. But it also struck me that something that Sinclair said, that a more innovative approach, a more nimble approach, a more sort of seeing things with a wider fisheye lens approach is probably the most sensible way that Australian policymakers can approach the region. And we've seen evidence over the last couple of years with the early throes of the seasonal workers scheme that that there's the potential for dividends to accrue through that.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I think, you know, one of the things that says to me is that often problems that appear to be primarily of a kind of security hue, or that are viewed through the lens of security, on drilling down actually have sort of development roots, and, you know, are obviously much more sort of complex and demand, you know, a range of different approaches if they're to be addressed adequately. And many of the issues that may manifest themselves as security problems, you know, need to be sort of viewed also through a development lens. And Gordon's example is a fine one of that. I think also, yes, in relation to, you know, thinking much more imaginatively about how Australia as a very wealthy country, sitting in a neighbourhood that is dominated by very poor countries, how we can best sort of utilise our resources and our know-how. That often means thinking much more in terms of what we can do back here, rather than sort of going over there, as Gordon says, and not being limited by thinking of these places as places where all the problems are concentrated inside, and therefore the solutions to those problems have to be found there. So thinking a bit more outside of the box. And I think another sort of aspect of that is that there's lots of creativity and energy in the region that, if we look beneath the level of the state and the sort of formal institutions, we see struggling, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully, in attempting to redress a whole lot of problems that people are experiencing on a day-to-day level. And I think one of the areas where there has been a lot of really interesting things going on has been on Bougainville, and I know that you, Joanne, have recently sort of been writing about that, and some of the creativity in Bougainville's approach to overcoming some of its problems.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's easy to forget when we talk about the instability that's occurred in the region. It's often only in the capital city. Out in the region, out in rural areas, people tend to be living their everyday lives pretty much untouched by whatever instability might be happening or not happening in the centre. But in Bougainville, there has been, since the crisis ended and there was the process of creating the autonomous region, there has been a real attempt to build on that local resilience, to recognise that people did have effective and legitimate ways of governing and of maintaining order and of organising themselves that were quite separate from what might have been going on at the level of the state. And in Bougainville, they've very cleverly built on that, and they've built their state in many ways. Well, they've built their region from the ground up, and they've used the locally legitimate councils of elders and village assemblies that were functioning at the local level as the foundations of the autonomous Bougainville government. And it has been, you know, the Bougainville government has had the challenge of very limited resources and some problems with the transfer of powers from Papua New Guinea. But these locally legitimate foundations have really helped the autonomous Bougainville government function quite effectively. And I think that's a model for other parts of the region. I believe they're exploring similar ideas in the Solomon Islands. I
think they are, and I was just going to say that Gordon and I have actually quite recently been to Bougainville looking at innovation in kind of police reform. And perhaps you'd like to say something, Gordon, about the very different kind of policing that we see evolving, which is not one that is sort of exclusively focused on law and order issues, but is much broader than perhaps people in Australia think about policing.
Yeah, I will, just before I do something that Joanne said, which just struck me, which was this issue about, you know, problems that, you know, what law and order problems there are. I was reminded of a comment that a colleague of mine, who was working for the UN police in Timor-Leste, made when he was talking about the crime figures that were going on in Dili, and he said you'd see more problems in an Australian country town, in a big Australian country town, on a Friday night than you necessarily would see in Dili in a week. And I think that's it's worth remembering that, because sometimes we tend to overblow some of the potential for problems here.
A feeling of a solution in search of a problem.
Well, that's a very good way to put it. That's a good phrase. I might keep that one. But one of the reasons why I think there are relatively low crime figures in places like Timor-Leste is because much of the resolution of disputes is actually not done by state-sanctioned authorities. I mean, figures, I think, I can't remember the exact figures that's been done by the OECD, seems to indicate that over 80% of disputes in the developing world are resolved through non-state means. But one of the interesting things that I found in Bougainville and on our travels there is exactly what Joanne is alluding to whenever she was speaking on it, that because of the conflict, because of ironically because of the problems that Bougainville had with state institutions, they've actually gone for a different they've gone down a different path, one that much more speaks to the way in which communities organize themselves in general, and places less faith in a kind of a state that sits up in a capital, often far away from people's lives. So Sinclair and I have just finished an evaluation on a policing program there, and one of the striking things about this evaluation was that we looked at two components, one of which was the state-based police, a police that looks like police that we think what they should look like. I mean, it has uniforms, it has cars, it has boots. And then we looked at the other component, which was a village-based
community auxiliary police.
That's right. That they were part of the community. What was very striking is that the community auxiliary police, which were very much part of the fabric of villages and rural communities throughout Bougainville, were A, doing most of the policing, B, were legitimate, C, were actually able to deal with most of the issues that there were to hand, and it was an almost a mirror opposite picture when it came to the state police. So, I mean, this is probably a conversation for the next time we're in the hot seat. But the question is, a lot of the work that's been going on, a lot of these arc of instability countries are about building up state institutions, institutions that look like what we think states look like. And something that I think that we both came to the conclusion when we were in Bougainville was how hollow state-like institutions were, but yet by contrast how thriving and resilient community-based organisations.
Yeah, that's right. I think it brings to my mind sort of James C. Scott's very famous notion of seeing like a state and the limitations of viewing the countries that are covered by the arc, which are amongst some of the most internally diverse in the world, socially and linguistically, through that particular prism, and that sort of leaves out a whole lot of really interesting things that are going on, and things that have been used to do things that we now, from our sort of external perspective, associate almost exclusively with what a state does. But these are essentially mechanisms that sort of operate beyond the state. But that sort of resilience, I think, is the whole area that's missed out by these sort of negative framings. And I think we're all agreed that any engagement on the part of Australia should really be able to build on resilience rather than simply, substitute, institutions and transfer institutions from here to there, as if that space is unoccupied or occupied only by dysfunctional images of our own sort of institutions. So I think changing lenses is sort of really important, and that goes as much for notions of arcs of instability as for anything else. But perhaps we could close by just sort of touching very briefly on where we go from here, in what I think we were all very clear about last Friday would be the beginning of a process, the beginning of a conversation, and I think there's some plans that we will sort of begin to think about this in terms of a longer term research project.
Yeah, I mean, we were very lucky at our workshop. Emeritus Professor Dibb came along, who he had originally, as I said, coined the phrase, and he came along and reflected on why he coined it at the time. And we have to remember that it was at a very different, the international environment was very different then. It was the Timor intervention had just occurred. We then had September 11, and we were caught up in the war on terror. And we have to remember that the phrase was framed in a very particular sense of threat and of failed states posing a threat to Australia. So, you know, Professor Dibb acknowledged at the workshop that the situation has changed, and I think he himself would say that the term no longer has the same resonance that it did, or if it ever did at the time it was coined. So I think the time is ripe to look for the opportunities and to move to this new framing of the arc of opportunity. And I think, as we've just discussed, a perfect opportunity is to build from what's going on the ground up in the Pacific. In terms of our work, I think we started the conversation very fruitfully between the strategic and security thinkers and the governance and development thinkers. And we should say that they're not necessarily always in two separate camps, but it was a very productive first step towards the dialogue continuing. So we do hope to produce an edited book drawing on some of the papers that were presented at the workshop. We're also, you know, looking for other opportunities, and hopefully they begin to emerge in the coming months.
So I think the message is watch this space.
Yes.
But I think that's a very good point at which we can draw the conversation to an end. So thanks, Joanne. Thanks, Gordon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sinclair.